The School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington presents Material Matters, a lecture series that examines what matters in the discipline of architecture and what is considered material in the practice of the architect.
I am a very small firm working out of the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle. This is our studio, which is directly behind my house. I actually built this with a good friend of mine in 2006. So I've been out here for a while now. My background is upstairs in the loft level. And it is a tiny little studio. It's 430 square feet on 2 levels. And I do say we a lot, and the reason why I say we is that my firm is not me. It's actually an amazing group of staff that have been with me for a number of years now, and includes other people that have been with me but have moved on to other places. So I sort of acknowledge that always at the beginning, or I try to acknowledge that, because all the work that I'm going to show is not just work that I've done. It's a collective, and in many cases, most of the work that I'm going to show is actually made by someone else. Very quickly, just to introduce my current staff, Sean Morgan, to the right of me, to the lower left is Shashi Zhao, and to the lower right is Scott Clausen. Again, they've all been with me for a number of years in varying time lengths. And then also, we don't have Karen Dwan up here on this. This is our recent Zoom portraits on our website, but Karen's been working with us for the last few months on a really important project. I wanted to acknowledge her. And then very quickly, this is the inside of our studio on the main level. Typically we have 4 people or so downstairs, and I'm not sure if I didn't include the other slide, but we have the upstairs also, the loft level, where we can have typically 2 people. So we have usually 5 to 6 of us in here in 430 square feet, and the 2 levels also allows for 2 conference tables. And I like to show this slide because it shows our sort of what we're about. We are definitely, while we use the digital tools that everyone uses, or some of the digital tools like Rhino and AutoCAD and blah, 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 we also are very much analog and are interested in making models and drawing and sort of creating a hybrid of working methods to create our work. So as Pia mentioned, we've known each other for a long time. And what I wanted to do was just have Pia and I talk for an hour about a word, because she and I can talk for 5 or 6 hours about a word, and we have done that. But she gently reminded me that the point of this is it's a lecture series where people talk about their work, and hopefully more specifically talk about the topic, the topic of material matters. I was pleased that she was open to defining what material means, because while of course we use materials, and material is important specifically as a literal word in us building architecture, I'm much more interested in expanding on what that word might mean. And for us specifically, the material that matters for us in our practice is process. And through Pia and I talking for many hours, like we like to do, she helped me sort of come to a way of thinking about or framing this lecture with the title Imagination, Memory, and Process, with the idea that I'm very interested in memory, and that'll be clear here in a little bit, and how memory is fundamentally important to what we make and what we create, how memory and process together then lead to the idea of imagination being what we're putting out there that results in work. So hence the topic, imagination, memory, and process. And I was trying to think of a way to sort of frame this quickly in the beginning. I've always loved this project that we did back in, I think it was completed in 2007, a large residence on Mercer Island nearby Seattle that I designed in collaboration with my partner at the time, Tom Mall. And it was a very long, steep, narrow, difficult site. And the challenge was, how do you get people into the house and how do you make that an experience? And what we came to as a solution was to really almost expand that experience, extrude that path all the way down this site, across streams and bridges, down a long stair. I presume people can see my cursor, and if not, I can draw on this, to the very center of the house. This is a view looking up that exterior stair. You're actually standing in the middle of the house. The house is actually below that stair, behind the stair, and you're looking back towards the subterranean courtyard that we carved out to create this sort of main living space. And if you turn around, you'll be looking at this amazing view of Lake Washington. And what I love about that is that somewhere along the line during the process, Tom and I realized, and it might have been after we built this project, that Gunnar Asplin's Stockholm Library, which is such an incredible building, is really the idea or the source of that scheme. If people don't know this project, and by the way, I should have said, I definitely set this lecture up to try to not talk to students, but really try to, I am teaching right now as well, so I think all of my students are in this presentation. My colleague Elizabeth Golden's students, I think, have joined, and I love the fact that UT Arlington students are in here as well. So P and I talked about this, of course I'm going to talk about my work, but I'm also talking about process because I think it's important to how we talk about design. And I like talking about process and how we go from one point to another. This building was definitely an important moment for Tom and I, or I don't know if it's a moment, but it was instrumental in generating this idea of the project, or the direction and motivation of our own project. And what you're seeing in the section, which is probably entirely too light for a lot of people to see, but the view that you're looking at is the main entry into this building, looking up a very long gradual stair into what you can see is a huge room. And in the section, the stair is right here. And what's beautiful about this building is you actually arrive at the middle of this huge, amazing library room. And what we did is we sort of inverted that idea, and we said, well, what if we arrived in the middle? What if we came down into the middle of this house? And I've always liked the fact that I don't remember when we realized that. And it doesn't matter if it was something we were conscious of, or if we realized it at the end. What's interesting to me is that I think that there really is a strong connection to that building. And it happened again just last night as I was putting all these slides together. I really love this project that we just completed with my best friend, Javier Sanchez, an amazing architect working out of Mexico City. He and I collaborated together on this project from start to finish. It's a house outside of Mexico City, up in the mountains. And he and I actually just did a lecture together for Casa Barragan, and we talked about the influence of the obvious case study to look at, or that we did look at and have visited together, or not together, but visited in person, Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House. And when I was looking at these images and starting to think about the influence and impact of Scandinavia on me as a student, because I spent 4 months in Scandinavia when I was a graduate student at University of Washington 25 years ago. And that experience was fundamentally important to see the work of all of these incredible architects and buildings. And what I realized last night was we really also created Sverre, or recreated, reinterpreted, translated, transcribed Sverre Fenn's incredible Schreiner house, one of his first houses that he ever built in the early 60s. I was lucky to have Einar Jarman as my advisor while I was in Oslo. He set up a time for me to get a tour of this with Mrs. Schreiner, who spent 2 hours taking us through this jewel box of a little building. And I don't think that Javier and I talked at all about this building in the process of designing the project that he and I worked on together. I do bring this project up a lot to students as well as in my studio, because it's always been something that stayed with me. And I love that moment. So with that in mind, that helped me sort of frame tonight as this idea of imagination, memory, and process. And I wanted to very specifically talk about two designs or buildings that we designed as part of a much larger conceptual project that we worked on for the span of 5 years. The project is called Memory Houses, and it's always a really tough one to talk about because there's too much material that we have, and there's way too many ways to come in to talk about it. So just stay with me as I try to figure out a way to get you on board quickly here. But it is all fictional or speculative designs, 8 or 9 designs, or designs for 8 or 9 buildings that are all on one site. And this site is real. All of the buildings are speculative and fictional, but the site is very special to me personally. The site is in Eastern Shore, Maryland. And this view is up above the most beautiful river that empties into the Chesapeake Bay. You're looking back towards the back of the site, a very gradual sloping field that goes down to the river. And as you probably saw in the site image or the aerial image, there's two very, for me personally, two really incredible little building, or one very little building, one relatively large building on the site. The large brick building is an old residence, 400 years old. And directly next to it, it's a little bit hard to see in the photograph, but very clearly you can see it in the floor plan, is a super tiny little milk house, a utility building that was used a long, long time ago to store, I guess, milk and dairy products because it has these super thick walls to keep things cool, and a very deep overhang with a little colonnade. The reason why this site is important, and this is sort of the beginning of the Memory Houses before I knew that it would be the Memory Houses project, is that when I was in graduate school in 1995, my father had planted vines on the site, and he was a huge wine fanatic, loved wine. I grew up in Germany as a kid, and that's where he fell in love with white wine especially. And he was a chemical engineer, so he loved processes and how things mix together and how they transform from one thing to another. And he asked me, he came up with this idea, and he was serious about building a winery on this site. And I was in graduate school, and he asked me if I would design a winery for him. And so this is actually my first commission. And I always say that with a grain of salt because he didn't pay me a dime. But it is my first, I sort of credit this as my first sort of real client. My father was my client. He and I worked on this together, especially in the sense that he talked a lot about the process of winemaking, where you see the grapes are crushed on the pad on the exterior. There's a way to bring things into the cisterns. Then you age the wine in caskets, and then you bottle it, and then it goes off to whoever wants to drink it. And the reason why this is an interesting, I think an interesting proposal is that, as you can probably see, there's a very clear reference to the telescope plan of this winery building and the telescope house on the site. The telescope house is a typology that you see actually pretty in various locations along the eastern seaboard. And it's called a telescope house because most of them are built in phases. Actually, ironically, this specific one we understand was possibly built first as a tiny little kitchen. Then they built the much larger portion of the house, and then they actually connected the two. But nonetheless, especially in its massing, you can see that there's this very clear telescope typology, which for me as a student was just so cool. And I was somehow okay with making that reference in this building. I think what helped me was that my dad was really interested in the process of wine, and I wanted to give each one of these processes of wine a place in this larger building. The other thing that he really wanted was a tasting room. You know, I didn't want to do a tasting room, but he really wanted the tasting room. And so I designed a tasting room, which you see in plan here, and it's maybe a little hard to tell, but in the elevation, you can see it's a shed building, sort of reaching up towards the views overlooking the water. And I always found that tasting room problematic in the grand scheme of things. Without going into it, I didn't need to sort of worry about it because very quickly the project died. This building never got built. So then that's fine. It didn't get built. And then you go 20 years later, and my father is 20 years older and becomes very ill and very quickly starts to suffer from memory loss and dementia. And you know, my parents are out on the East Coast. I'm in Seattle. And if anyone in the audience has dealt with dementia or memory loss with a loved one or family members, it's a pretty crazy time. And in some ways, what was interesting about this experience, well, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but I can speak for myself that what was strange was that I was 3,000 miles away. And so in many ways, I was sheltered from a lot of the stuff going on, whereas my mother and my younger brother were dealing with things on the ground. But at the same time, I had this weird, strange experience of when I went back between 2 and 3 months between times that I'd gone back, my father did not see me or in the same way that he had when I was there before. And in some cases, I wondered, did he even know who I was? Whereas I think people that were close to him, obviously because they're seeing him every day, there's a connection that is maybe held on to longer. So anyway, sort of long story short, this was this crazy time for our family, and I'm out here trying to figure things out. And what somehow I came to was that maybe what I could do was start a project again. General idea was that, you know, could I pick up this project that I'd always loved and that he and I did together, and could it be perhaps a way to have a conversation with someone that you can't have anymore? Because you can't pick up a phone, like if someone doesn't really know who they're talking to, it's a little hard to pick up the phone and talk to them. So not sure if that makes any sense in my head even now, but that's what was in my head. And I thought, well, what if I address this tasting room that I hated, or not hated, but I never was resolved with, and what if I come back to this winery building that I've always loved and create a new project? This is the section through the winery building. And so what was interesting is we sort of pretended that this building actually existed. We made a rule set in the studio that, well, this rule set came right after I started designing the new building next to it. But one of the rules was, let's pretend this building exists. And that meant that we couldn't touch it. We had to sort of, the rule was that it had to stay exactly the way it is. And what was interesting 20 years later is that, you know, now I've got 20 years of, quote, experience under my belt, and I feel maybe a little bit more clear regarding my intentions and what I'm interested in. And for some reason, I had no problem at all just accepting the obvious fact that what I needed to do was a pyramid-shaped building next to this winery building. And what became also interesting is I started thinking about program, like what would this building be? And I started thinking about, well, what if it was a chapel for my father, a memorial chapel, and a columbarium for the family? Sort of deep dive right into interesting programmatic issues related to a winery building. But somehow all this stuff clicked together very quickly. These are a few of the early sketches of starting to think about what this chapel and columbarium might be. Actually, you can see it's a little hard to tell, but oops. Right here, you can see the relationship of the chapel to the winery building. The winery building is barely sketched in. And I just think that's, looking back on that, I think it's just sort of interesting that it was so obvious to me now. And it was, I recall very clearly, it was something that I did not want to do at all 20 years before. But suddenly now I think there was this very interesting relationship between, there already was an interesting relationship between these two existing buildings on the site. I was trying to create a relationship between two buildings adjoining these two buildings on the site. And so I think that sort of dialogue became quite interesting as we move forward. Here you're seeing this was actually a very rapid succession of events in 2 days, where I very quickly just drew through a working drawing the section of that chapel and the subterranean columbarium. I don't have time to sort of go into a lot of the nuances of this, but what you can see is the obvious reference to the milk house on the right with the pyramidal chapel, and then on the left is the winery building. And also a very, very simple square plan relationship to the milk house. And what was interesting once we did this, and once I sort of got to that point, I started opening this up as a conversation with my office. And what was interesting about it is we all sort of got on board with that. It was like, yeah, let's just define the constraints here. And this was not a formal exercise for us. We felt very compelled that this building we did not need to explore formal options for this. And instead it became all about investigating all of the different pieces and material options for these pieces and how they might relate to each other. Here you're seeing some conceptual models that are exploring the relationship of the steel frame to the wood framing of the roof. The steel frame is there so it can cantilever out across the site, which you'll see in a minute. You're seeing the concrete internal piece that we also considered as brick. A lot of different material investigations here that we're considering, while the formal relationships have already been established. And then not just thinking about what those things are, but how do they relate together as a whole. This is an exploded axonometric showing all the little pieces. I love this exercise because we really, as a team, came through long conversations together, came to a true understanding of what this building is, even though we knew it would never ever be built. And I think there's something interesting about sort of taking something to the level where you know it could be built. So it's hard to see on your screen, but this tiny little square above the hip roof building is the steel compression ring for all these members to attach themselves to. And again, at least for this specific project for us, maybe the culmination or the realization of the project was the physical model. In this case, a section model that really explored the materiality and the assembly of this building, and through that, the spatial qualities and the light qualities coming into the building. And out of this, we started in the office, started talking about what is architecture? When do you go from model to architecture? And that has sort of established, 5 years ago, that established an ongoing discussion about scale and at what point, is at what point does something stop being a model and start being architecture? For us, this was starting to be architecture, partly because we knew it would never be built. The other thing I love about this section in both the model and in the drawing is that Pia herself is has talked about this section as being sort of interesting in the sense that it's almost about turning the building down into the ground and really rooting this building into the ground, which I had never thought of it that way, and I like that idea of thinking, and I'll expand on that a little bit more in a few slides. But then coming back to this idea of memory and references, what was interesting for this project when I started designing the chapel was that I immediately had a very clear reference in my mind as to what I was trying to connect to, and that was seeing these incredible stave churches in Norway when I was a little boy. My parents took me to Norway. Well, took my brothers and I to Norway when I was probably 4 or 5. And it was such a clear memory of mine all throughout my childhood up into going to architecture school. There's a whole bunch of amazing things about these buildings. One of them that I think is incredible is the scale of them, which you can sort of see from this photograph. You're seeing the wheelchair here below the eaves of this building. And I love the people standing here on the other side of the wall. And the scale, you think that these buildings are so much larger than they really are. When you arrive there, even me as a little boy, I was like, wow, this building's like sized for me. They are so diminutive, even though they try to look like something grandiose. The other thing that's really amazing is how low these eaves are. And I was able to see these when I was in Norway in grad school. And the amazing thing is how low those eaves are. And so you can see in the design of this chapel, here's a person standing, that even when they've stepped down to the top of the columbarium, that when you're standing, you still do not look out to the horizon. You only look out to the horizon when you sit down and then look through the space between the sort of hovering shroud and the foundation itself, which you're seeing here in this exterior view. So I was really conscious of those buildings as guiding the design of this chapel, even down to a material quality, but also the quality of light on the inside is pretty astounding, partly because, well, not partly, but I think completely because the buildings are all wood, and this photograph actually, I think, shows these spaces having more light than they actually do. When you step inside of these, they're almost pitch black, partly because you've been outside in the daylight, and then suddenly you're immersed in this dark building. But the exterior and interior of these buildings had such a strong connection to where I wanted this project to go, which here you're seeing another render. The renderings that I show of these were done by Tristan Walker, who worked with us on this project. And then as I was thinking about this presentation today, I couldn't help but think of other references or memories that I've had more recently being in Scandinavia. Sigurd Leverentz's incredible final church, St. Peter's. And even the use of steel and the way steel is being used, you see in our project as well. It's maybe not as clear in this rendering, but this is the steel frame here. And then there's a wood superstructure that is hung off of that. The very, very strong light through these punched apertures that you're seeing in a similar manner in our roof. And then I even thought about this incredibly beautiful house in Takayama. I was lucky enough to be in Japan in 2010 and was able to see a lot of incredible buildings. And the way light is reflected off of this dark wood is something that we were looking for in our own project. Pia wrote a beautiful essay for or in my book, along with several other really beautiful essays by other close friends. And I really love the title of the essay that she chose, which is Remembering Forward. And so I like the idea I just like that title. I like the idea of remembering forward. And it made me think about how after this chapel had been designed and finished, if you will, when we had finished being done with the models, I was hired to design a house directly next door to me. I'm looking at it from here. It's 10 feet away. It's a small 800 square foot backyard cottage. And like we do for a lot of our projects, we looked at probably 15 to 20 schemes. And I really love that the last one that we looked at, the last one that we developed, the last one that actually became the one that our client liked the most, has a very interesting geometric relationship to the very chapel that we had just designed. Not just that it's a square, but that there's intentionally a rotational, symmetrical, but also rotational condition that's happening in these buildings, which is quite obvious when you're looking at these two floor plans. In the case of the chapel, that you're actually coming in on a corner, and then you are given the choice of going down one stair or going down the other, and you come in and sort of slide into the center of the building. In the case of the house next door, you actually come in pretty much centrally on the house, but then the stair is what separates the building into 4 quadrants, and then the rotation occurs through the way we deal with apertures and the relationship to the outside, such that you have 4 relationships to all 4 cardinal directions of light. Again, Pia is the one who pointed out that besides that interesting relationship, there's an inverted relationship between this building and the chapel. The chapel has this very strong rooted connection down into the ground. This one, we thought of everything on the interior is like a tree that clambers up inside a 2-story space, branches out, lightens out as it goes up to the ceiling. I have 2 images that I threw in here. This is right after you have arrived. And I do love the efficiency of this plan, because when you enter the front door, you can go upstairs, you can go left into the kitchen, you can go right into the double height piano room, or you can turn around and go outside. And then when you get up to the top of the stair, you have arrived in the center of the house, sort of similar to the first project I showed. And you have 4 choices again. You can step up into the bathroom, you can step up to the left into the bedroom, you can step up to the right into the den or the office, or you can turn around and go back downstairs. And so there's a super hyper efficient floor plan that took a long time to develop. But I really feel strongly that the only way we were able to get to that was by actually designing a chapel in the first place. This is showing upstairs just before our clients moved in. I have to watch my time. Right, Pia?
Yes.
So I'm just going to keep going with this notion of remembering forward. And I love that about this chapel, because it sort of kept going. It showed up next door, and then we were honored and super excited to be invited to do an exhibition at Casa Barragan's Jardín studio site across from Luis Barragan's house in Mexico City. And as much as I would love to show that, what I specifically wanted to quickly show is the chapel that we proposed to build on top of this studio, Barragan studio. The exhibition was of the Memory Houses project, the entire project. So we had models and drawings and you name it. And installation is important to our studio. We've done a number of architectural installations. And we were like, wow, we have a real opportunity to do something here. We originally tried doing something downstairs in one of the exhibition rooms, but once we realized what we wanted to do, which was to construct a half-scale version of the very chapel that we had assumed would never be built, it wouldn't fit in the exhibition room. And so we asked Catalina, the director, if we could build it on top. And she said we could build it on top of the roof. And what's pretty interesting about this installation is that we wanted to create a half scale of the chapel, but we also wanted it to be almost like a ghost of the chapel, like almost a memory of the chapel that would never be built. And by this time, my father had passed away. And what was interesting is we're always looking at artists' work. Saul LeWitt is a huge influence of ours in a number of, especially installation projects that we've done. I've always loved this project that he did, Variations of Incomplete Open Cubes, where he looks at every single different variation that you could do to a cube without actually making it a cube. And so borrowing from that idea, we proposed only a frame, a timber frame on the rooftop that was hovering above the rooftop itself. And we tried to construct this frame to be as minimal as possible. So we got rid of all the corner columns. We put in a foundation beam that sat on the curb that allowed it to hover out over the rooftop. And then just and even the roof beams were minimized to only the points in line with the columns. So it had this actually pretty interesting structural solution to it that allowed the loads to make their way back to only 2 points. Again, an asymmetrical floor plan. Here's 1 point for the bearing, and the other point is back in the corner here. And then we really like the idea of a ghost of a chapel, and we clad it in a material that we've actually used before in installation projects, a monofilament fishing line that sort of became the way of completing the form of the chapel. You can see right here is the hip roof, but depending on your vantage point and when you're walking around it, sometimes it would completely disappear. So there is a sort of quality of emergence and disappearance happening in the installation. This is looking up towards the sky with the monofilament showing the sunlight shining onto it. It keeps going. Then after we dismantled the building, we started talking with my friend Javier about the possibility of rebuilding this chapel on the site that I'd shown of the house that he and I designed outside of Mexico City. And this is right now an idea that we're floating around regarding exactly what it's going to be. This was a proposal to rebuild the frame as a meditation and music performance space on the site. So there is this sort of ironic condition about this project where we set out to not build a building, and yet we ended up building a temporary half-scale version of it, which ultimately possibly will become a real building on a site. Reusing the frame, but then cladding it with the very same idea that we had originally for the chapel. We're actually starting to lean towards the idea of this as a mushroom building, which I'm sort of excited about. So transitioning, before I go into the second memory house, I wanted to step back and just very quickly talk about the site. And because I think how the project developed after the chapel was quite interesting. So we designed the chapel with the idea of just doing it. We built the models and we thought we were done. My father passed away. And then right afterwards, we were talking about the project and other ideas started coming up about other buildings that could occur on the site. And as we started talking more and more about it, we became interested in the idea of just seeing where it went. So I use this word trigger a lot, especially with students, and Pia and I have talked about the word. I like the word trigger because it has this, well, it comes from Hugo's Triggering Town book on writing, and this idea of let whatever comes in your mind, that becomes a way to create poetry. And I do believe that process is about honoring anything that's coming to our table. And of course, just because something arrives doesn't mean that you accept it, but it's game. I'm trying to think where I was going with that, but what became interesting was to think about the greater site and to think about how, as we started designing different buildings on this site, and actually maybe I should go to the site plan itself. Where is it? Sorry, my computer seems a little bit slow. This is the site. Here's the river, the telescope house, and the milk house is right here. Here is the winery that we designed, and here is the chapel. And this is the final site plan showing all of the buildings that we designed over the course of 5 years. There became some intentions regarding providing separation between all the buildings. We didn't want to have, well, obviously these two buildings have a very close proximity to them, but the other buildings had intention regarding why they were separate. And the idea of those buildings and how they related to each other, and this idea of site and narrative and a way of walking through the site very clearly comes from Leverance and Osplin's Woodland Cemetery, which is such an incredible experience to go to. My wife is not an architect, she's a graphic designer, but when we went here, I still remember we walked around and went through all the different areas of the site. As we were leaving, she said, you know what, I think I want to be buried here. It's such an amazing place to just be in. And very much about narrative and spatially thinking about landscape as space. I think Luis Barragan famously said that landscape architecture is architecture because it's all about spatial sequences and thinking about how you move from space to space. And that's clearly happening here. My favorite sequence is Leverance's path that leads you down from the hill with the grove of trees down towards this building, and really starting to understand that architecture it doesn't have to be landscapey. Like, it can be embedded in landscape, like this building where you think you're heading towards a very symmetrical classical building, and I don't have the photo, but once you arrive, you realize that actually the building is oriented in the opposite direction, and he wanted you to enter in on the building and exit in a different way. And I think that sort of that relationship between interior and exterior and sequence and thinking about buildings as extensions of the site was something that we became very interested in our project that has clear references and is indebted to the Woodland Cemetery. Our way of trying to make connections directly between these is maybe a little bit weird, but we ended up connecting them through a train, a railroad that does not exist on the site. But the train actually arrived in the chapel originally, in the original drawing, where I started wondering, how do people get to this chapel or to this winery, or how does the wine get away? I wanted one way to get in and out. I wanted a funerary train to bring the ashes of the loved ones to the chapel. I wanted the wine to leave on the same route. And we came up with this idea of a train doing that. And my father, of course, was a huge model railroad fanatic, which had a lot to do with this decision. But what is interesting about that is that it then sort of gave us a way to think about how these buildings are connected, all the way down to the boathouse and the house for a widow, which then turns into a model or a marine railway to take a boat all the way across to a lighthouse, which we don't have time to talk about today. But because we have a train, it then allowed us to think, well, where do the trains stay? Where's the house for trains? And again, this, as you can see, this project was a little bit of a boom, 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 stuff all over the place, and us getting excited about things and just letting that happen. But we did start to really think, interestingly, about roundhouses as a typology. We became interested in what a house is. What does it mean to be a dwelling? What's the difference between a house for trains and a house for people? And of course, the geometry that is so fascinating about roundhouses. And luckily, I happened to be in Rome at the time, at the Academy in Rome, and was starting to work on this project in detail. We had an exhibition coming up, and I had to design 4 buildings while I was there. And the roundhouse was a perfect thing to think about relative to Rome, particularly these centralized plans. My staff in Seattle created all of these drawings for me, going online and going into books and drawing these and scaling them so that we had an understanding of how big they are relative to each other. This is Trajan's Column right here, the Tempietto. But really thinking about these spaces, but also, and drawing them, but also being able to visit them was such an incredible experience. Very quickly, I'm going to take you through the design sequence of this specific roundhouse building, where you're seeing early sketches of what this might be like. And very early on, we became interested in a subterranean condition that you would never see in a roundhouse. And that's where we started thinking that maybe the trains are at the main level where they have to be, and that there could be a subterranean museum with model railroads. Again, sort of a reference back to my father. This is an early section and plan that I drew in Rome, where you're starting to see that subterranean sectional condition and its relationship to the main level of the turntable. You're seeing all the where the trains can sort of park themselves underneath the roof, and then the hole in the ground down to the subterranean level with the round table that turns and is also a bridge to span over that. And what was the obvious reference that I didn't actually pick up on until I think I had drawn several plans is Santo Stefano Rotondo, which I think is probably one of the most amazing buildings in Rome. I mean, it's a little bit of a brave thing to say, but I just kept going back to this building. It really was an incredible experience to be able to keep going back. And for those that know it, there is a very intriguing arched wall right in the middle that bisects this central space. There's a raised space that then allows light down into the middle of the space above the altar. And I couldn't help but think that there's some interesting parallels to the roundhouse and the turntable that I was designing. This was a challenging, well, they were all challenging projects. On this one, the real challenge was the geometry of the roof and how we resolve the roof. How do trains get in underneath the roof? And spatially, how do we create a diversity of space? We wanted to create a different section all the way around this building. It's not a very good scan of this project, but a very nice thing that helped us out was Hiroshi Maito's Makino Museum of Plants and People in Kochi that I was able to see in 2010. Really incredible use of geometry, but at the same time, rigorous structure. And so through that and the models, we finally came to the final project that you're seeing here. So this undulating or changing section of a helical shell roof that is hovering above the landscape and almost held to the ground through a series of very, very thin columns. And then a view underneath. And one last, remembering forward, I love that geometry really had an impact on me, or not just geometry, but sort of the simplicity of these incredible buildings in Rome, but also incredible diversity of space through section. And I couldn't help but think of shortly after working with Javier on this beautiful site outside of Mexico that I've talked about. There's a separate building that we were designing, which was a bathhouse with 4 different spaces for bathing. And the obvious reference for Javier and I was immediately Lucan's Trenton Bathworks. Very rigorous floor plan, in this case, Greek cross. But I was also really intrigued with, while I was in Rome, with the Tempietto, which I had always understood as this incredible isolated building sitting in a very severe blank courtyard. And then to learn that actually Bramante's original intention was to not have, to almost have the antithesis of that, to not have an object building, but rather to completely blur the line between this cloister and an interior or an exterior courtyard space, and another cloister, and then the chapel itself. And that was completely eye-opening, and I think definitely had a lot to do with Javier and I resorting to sort of being inspired by Kahn's building and its program and its relationship with spaces to each other, but also thinking about the fact that this space is different than this space, which is different than the center space. And these are recently completed or recent photos of the completed building. The green roof still has to come in, but you can see that the center of this building is open to the sky, and it is a bathing pool itself, which when the sun is out, has these incredible qualities of light and shadow. And then when it rains, and it rains heavily there for 6 months, the entire building just becomes immersed in water. I don't have probably time to talk about this because it's already 5, and I want to make sure I talk about the dynamic landscapes. I will just very briefly say that there was an interesting moment during the exhibition where Javier and I actually went to Ceramic Azuro in Guadalajara to be looking at tile, lots of different tiles for the bathhouse. And I realized that this work that they were doing there was incredible. And I wondered, well, what if for our exhibition we did a series of ceramic sculptures that reinterpreted the designs of all the memory houses only as objects, only as formal qualities. And that became a whole new design project of how do you take a lightweight shell building with a bunch of thin columns and figure out a way to let it hover on a table and be a beautiful object in its own right. This is the 3D printed final roundhouse that Xiaoxi did in my office that took us forever to figure out how to do, where we ended up undulating the spine of the underside of this to allow it to hover. These are all the casts that they had done in Ceramic Azuro that when I visited right before they started doing all the casts. You can see here's the negative of the positive. This is the 3D printed model that we gave them. And we had to redesign all of these buildings to be cast, which was quite interesting to sort of get rid of the tectonics, get rid of the program, and just look at the form now and think about how do you redesign that and create something new. And these are the final casts in the exhibition itself. This is actually the last thing I wanted to present, and it's sort of a moving on from memory houses transition. The memory houses was an amazing project that so many people worked on, and I think really took us in a lot of places that we never expected to. And after the exhibition and publishing a book about it, I think we got finally to the place where we felt like it was winding down. What's happened since is I was honored to be a fellow through the real estate department at University of Washington, the Runstad Real Estate Department. I went to Japan with 4 other fellows. I was the only architect. There was a landscape architect, a policy maker, I'm trying to think of the other people, but whole point being that it's a whole mix of people going over, and we as a group, our charge was to think about what will we look at for Seattle, with the idea that it's about looking at another place and how we can learn something from another place and bring it back to Seattle regarding the built environment. And we became very interested in Seattle's susceptibility to earthquakes, and arguably the fact that we are not yet set up to really handle the earthquake that we're supposed to get sometime soon. Soon is relative, it could be 300 years, but we just became interested in seismic, being prepared for a seismic event, and resiliency, and decided that we would take our funds. They basically give you a lump sum amount of funds for the 5 of you to go wherever you want with that amount of money and study something, come back, do more research, and then report to the city. And so we chose Japan for obvious reasons. They are arguably one of the most prepared for earthquakes. And while we were there, what I don't think any of us were prepared for is when we went to Sendai, where the Tohoku earthquake came through, we visited this school, I'm trying to remember, the Aramba, I'm sorry, I forget the name of the school. But it was a school that was hit by the tsunami, like everyone was along the entire Tohoku coastline. Most of the people survived, but being there was a pretty incredible experience to hear people that survived it. And also to just be driving around and seeing this crazy infrastructure of evacuation towers, where it's designed for people to, because they don't have much time, they're going to have to get up to the top so that the tsunami can come through. And these are all over the place. The other thing that really hit me hard was the infrastructure that they've constructed along the entire coastline. This is a huge wall right on the beach. This is standing on top of it, and it goes on forever. And just thinking about the impact of this, there's many ways of looking at this. There's a reason why it exists, and this has all been built since 2011. But it would really hit me. I came home and I just became fascinated by it. I started looking up more stuff on this. These are images from online of other walls throughout these communities. And the immediate thing that you realize is, wow, like the very thing that the people wanted to be connected to, historically, the very memory that they have to the sea is being completely cut off for, again, obvious reasons. But some of these photos gives you a sense of the scale of this. And that fascinated me. Did more and more research, learned more and more about stuff. And the other thing that really hit us was Osamu Tsukihashi's beautiful and poignant memory houses project. Osamu is an actually quite talented architect working out of Kobe. And when the event happened, he and his students and many other colleagues were sort of at a loss of, well, what can we do here? Everyone wants to help, everyone wants to do something, but there's especially right after the event, there's a question of what can you really do, particularly they were in Kobe and this all happened on the coastline. He and his students came up with this idea of what if we, as you probably know, these communities, many of them were completely destroyed. And so they came up with this idea of what if we recreated the community that no longer exists. And they ended up spending a fair amount of time very quickly doing a lot of research on GIS and Google Earth. And they created models. Well, specifically, they created a model of one of the communities that he knew some people who were affected by this. And they created this model out of just white little buildings with topography, and they gave the model to the community. And they didn't have any intentions of what might happen. They hoped that somehow people would connect to it. And what was interesting is that the community members really did sort of gather around and start talking about the place that used to exist. And their way of engaging with the model was they started actually creating these little notes that have memories of the very place that that is so important to them. A lot of them are like, this is where I met my husband, this is where my child played in a playground, whatever, across the board. And I think for Osama, it was quite interesting because suddenly it was like, wow, this is actually giving them a way, one level to grieve, but also to come together and also talk about what used to be there, and also in an interesting way talk about the future. What could, what do we, now that we can understand what used to be here, and we can, as a community, we can look at this as a place and understand it through the model. Could that be a way to start making decisions about what we do in the future? I actually recently interviewed him, which was published in one of our local magazines. And so that project, interestingly enough, connected us to the South Beach community of Washington State. Because after I came back from Japan, I became interested in tsunami, particularly how it could affect our own coastline. And we are, some people don't know it, but some scientists believe that over the next 300 years, we're due for a 9+ earthquake and a tsunami that is similar in scale to what they experienced in Tohoku. So I started looking into our own coastline and seeing what was being done to prepare, and submitted this project to the Architectural League's American Roundtable initiative, and we were one of the 10 teams that was selected. So you're seeing a few of the sheets from our rough draft. This will be online hopefully soon. This is showing the tsunami inundation that would occur in the South Beach community, which is this long stretch of land here. This is Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay. And basically a lot of the Washington coastline as well as Oregon coastline is quite susceptible to this. There's been a fair amount of looking at this already, which I've done a lot of research on and sort of connected with people that have already been working on this. The Washington State Department of Natural Resources and the Geological Survey have done all these incredible maps that talk about tsunami evacuation walk times for the public to have a better understanding of how long it takes them to walk from here to high ground. That in turn has turned into quite interesting scenarios, because if you have a 9+ earthquake, you're not going to drive anywhere. So you're going to have to walk, and these walk times make people realize that they don't have enough time in 15 minutes to half an hour to get out of the way. So these circles are, the centers of these circles are where they feel like they need to have future evacuation towers. So once again, connecting me back to my studies in Japan, this is actually the first vertical evacuation platform in the country, the Okasta Elementary School, where they put the evacuation platform above the elementary school gym. This can take 2,000 people. By the way, these drawings are all by my colleague Corey Matthias. He's one of the contributors on this with me. But this is after the tsunamis come through. These have to be at a certain elevation based on the assumption of what the wave height is. And then more prototypically, they're starting to look at a series of these towers throughout the area. So as architects, we've become very interested in these buildings and what the design issues are. This is a sort of interesting typology, because you're trying to keep the building as open as possible at the ground level, but you're trying to support it as high as possible, and you're trying to support 2,000 people on a platform. So you need structure to do that. So there's this sort of counterintuitive design process of how do you do that, which I can't help but think is a really amazing opportunity, which brought me back to sort of my interest in the tsunami infrastructure itself, which is how can we start thinking about these buildings as connecting more to the community rather than being designed to be singular buildings that serve only one purpose, and they might not even be used for that purpose, how could these two levels or multiple levels be used in ways that support communities on a daily basis? And with that, my final slide is Eric Johnson's amazing photographs. He's another contributor. These are two photographs of the memory of a huge concrete culvert that used to be State Route 105 that went through this incredibly dynamic landscape 30 years ago, and now the ocean has completely cleaned it, and we're looking east or west towards Japan, where I will be going next year for 4 months to actually really investigate the infrastructure of the Tohoku earthquake.